So welcome, Jean, and we are very much looking forward to hear from you what you have to say about culturally appropriate or cultural appropriation, a provocation.
Right. Thank you to Ben and to Francisca and to Micah for organising this conference and for inviting me. My thanks also to Dorina. And I'm hoping that I'm not going to cover too much similar ground or steal or borrow any of your material. I do want to use a PowerPoint mainly because I find talking heads for 30 minutes can be extremely boring. And so to give you something else to look at, I'm going to try and share my screen and see if we can get this to work. I'm trying to get the slideshow to work. Yes. So you can now see the slideshow, I hope. Good. Okay. I acknowledge the elders, past, present, and emerging, and people of the Whadjuk Noongar Boodja, on whose unceded land I live and work. I recognise my position as a white settler Australian woman who seeks to write with integrity, whilst acknowledging my incapacity to comprehend First Nations and also non-human life worlds, which are not mine. I apologise if I've inadvertently appropriated and depoliticised ideas and knowledges in this paper. Any omissions or erasures are unintentional effects of my inherent limitations. Many of you will be either living in formerly or continuing colonised or colonising states. Transformations of urban and non-urban landscapes worldwide have often implicated projects of colonialism directly or indirectly by engagement of Western planners and architects and their ideas in both education and practice. Today, marginalisation of Southern and non-Anglophone scholarship and theories is being countered, as Dorina showed us, by the emergence of intersectional Black, Latinx and Indigenous work. Calls for decolonisation and indigenisation of theories and practices are widespread. I problematise the actualisation of truly decolonised planning theories, however, given the philosophical and institutional foundation and development of spatial planning as a Western colonial discipline. Nevertheless, the diversity of ways of being, of thinking, of conceiving time, apprehending the relations of humans amongst themselves and with other than humans is infinite. And to date, most planning theorists have largely ignored this diversity or not recognised and valued its potential contribution, with the notable exceptions of Dorina's new book and of the work of Vanessa Watson, Oren Yiftakal, Libby Porter and Leonie Sandercock in particular. There's a need to deconstruct the master narratives of Western-centric planning theories and the infrastructures which produce them. Ortiz suggests that we might regard theory generation as a counter-storytelling project with the potential to generate new theoretical configurations. 21st century theorists are increasingly begging, stealing, and borrowing ideas from First Nations peoples. There's now a huge literature available on decolonisation, indigenisation, and so on, and it's mainly centred on the Americas. I have a table of contents email feed, and I'm getting 10 new publications a day on decolonisation. It's the fastest moving field I've ever seen. And I cannot possibly do justice to this literature. And I will post a list of references if you like, at the end on chat, but I recommend Ortiz's work and Vasudevan and Novoa for fairly good literature reviews of material, and even that is out of date. Most literature comes from the discipline of geography, and as yet there appears to be relatively little material from planning, aside from Dorina's recent volume and that edited by Oren Yiftakal and Mammon. In fact, Clements et al., they produced a systematic review of 384 spatial planning related papers published between 1995 and 2021. And they found that only 19% referenced Indigenous themes and only 3 mentioned decolonisation. Many argue the cultural appropriateness of developing theories grounded in Indigenous thought. Elsewhere, scholars seem to frame theories in line with First Nations relational ontoepistemologies, especially, it seems, with regard to ecosystems. And I regard where the deployment of such ontoepistemologies by non-First Nation theorists may actually be acts of cultural appropriation and recolonization into what remains predominantly systems of oppression and exploitation. So my aim today is to try and unpack some of the terms commonly engaged in decolonization and colonization theories and debates. What do they actually mean? So the structure, we come from West is best, or is it? I'll talk briefly about indigenization. What does this mean? The historically and spatially contingent positionality of what is considered indigenous. Settler colonialism and its counter, decolonization. Decolonization scholarship is often undertaken in relation to climate change and environmentally related issues. While it affirms First Nations knowledges of and relationships with humans and other than humans, as popularly used, the work may be colonizing or appropriating of such knowledge, distorting it, co-opting knowledges, often in isolation from the intrinsic structural, social, and cultural factors to which they relate, and thereby reproducing global Northwestern-centric norms and privileges. Decoloniality seeks to delink from Western-centered ontoepistemologies that silence or marginalize non-white voices. It seeks to transgress the borders of Western thinking and to particularly avoid universalism. I also distinguish between reparative, repatriative, reconciliatory, and epistemic decolonization approaches. And I'll argue that theorizing and practicing differently will require new vocabularies and new methodologies in planning, which reaffirm the rights of First Nations people to control knowledge about their lands and peoples, and which ceases to view spatial or land use planning as a mechanical application of principles and policies, or which acknowledges or incorporates First Nations by depictions of what I see around me here, artworks on noise baffles along highways, tokenistic street names, or in the city of Melville, where I live, art on the sides of refuse trucks. I will offer a version of Anishinaabe scholar Kathy Absalon's Indigenous Holistic Theory, which asserts Indigenous knowledge, before concluding that even though we might develop new, culturally appropriate planning theories, or pluriversal theories, or epistemologies of the South, as they've been called, theories alone will not disrupt colonial or Western-centric systems, structures, and power. So, West is best, or is it? In my travels internationally, I've seen many non-Western places in Africa, China, and so on, that have clearly engaged Western planners and architects in their design and construction. For example, there's the recently opened Grand Egyptian Museum in Cairo by Hanagan Pung, the Merdeka 118 in Kuala Lumpur by Fender Katsalidis, the Burj Khalifa in the UAE by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, and the Guangzhou Opera House in China by Zaha Hadid, none of these by local people. In Australia in the 1990s, an independent group of architects and planners in Perth called City Vision were lobbying to improve Perth by making it more like Vancouver or Portland or wherever was trendy at the time. And my question, why don't we make Perth like Perth and use our own ideas, fell on deaf ears. This was a time of what was loosely called the cultural cringe, where any local ideas were discarded in favour of those from Europe or the USA, deemed to be the epicenter of all things good. And I've also felt qualms during my teaching career, both in the UK and Australia, about teaching overseas students locally based planning practices and theory. I've had several arguments with colleagues about teaching, for example, Maldivian or Chinese students, the British or Australian urban and regional planning systems and ways of working, which I've long regarded as inappropriate to their future careers back home. And this is something which has finally been recognised by Shirt and Chu Shi this year. I think that such a unidirectional transfer of knowledge and an obscuring of difference leads to a universalization that perpetuates or creates new forms of misrecognition of local cultures and knowledges. It's a form of indoctrination, albeit unintended. And I ask you, what and how do you teach international students? Western theories and authors are taught internationally in planning schools and beyond, probably because the academics themselves were taught these or similar theories. Boaventura de Sousa Santos cites the example of Habermas's theory of communicative action, which became a universal model for discursive rationality. And I've taught it and I've written about it, so I'm equally at fault for this. Asked whether he thought that his theory might be of use in the third world, that's not my expression, or whether their local ideas could be of use to advanced countries, Habermas replied, I'm aware of the fact this is a Eurocentric limited view. I would rather pass on the question. As de Sousa Santos points out, in spite of its so-called universality, Habermas's communicative action excludes about 4/5 of the world's population because of criteria whose legitimacy resides in the universality ascribed to them. For example, Habermas states that participants should be able to reach a position of mutual understanding through equal, open, and constraint-free intersubjective reasoning and discussion and the force of the better argument. But clearly, this cannot happen in many parts of the world. For de Sousa Santos, therefore, Habermas's communicative action turns out to be an imperial universalism in full control of the decision about its own limitations, thereby imposing itself upon both what it includes and what it excludes. Sometimes, however, indoctrination is more direct, as with the introduction and popularization of constructive postmodernism in China as a deliberate strategy of theological spread or colonization by the Institute for the Postmodern Development of China. And the image you've got on there is a map of their what they call their process centers in China associated with the universities. And this was founded by the theologian John Cobb Jr. and based at the Claremont School of Theology in California. They now have 36 research centers in China, rumored to be indirectly funded by a US government agency, and I'll let you guess which one. So what's indigenization? Calls for indigenization increase as the limitations of Northwestern theories and practices are realized. There's an increasing sensitivity to and awareness of the richness of indigenous cultures and onto epistemologies. Radcliffe defines indigeneity as the social spatial processes and practices whereby indigenous people and places are determined as distinct, ontologically, epistemologically, culturally, as sovereignty and so on, to dominant universals. Current understandings of indigenization hold that knowledge should arise from within culture, reflect onto epistemologies and practices, and be locally relevant to indigenous peoples. Understandings also hold that attempts at theorization must recognize contextualization as continually evolving practice by indigenous communities, not for them. Tanana Athabaskan scholar Diane Million, for example, defines indigenous theorizing as something that we do every day, in any moment where we make a proposition about what's happening and why. On my research visits to China, I realized that adopting Western theories and practices in Chinese spatial planning wasn't working. It was like putting square pegs into the round holes of Chinese cultural ways of being. So I've attempted to develop, in association with Kang Tao from Zhejiang University, a new theory for spatial planning, culturally embedded in Chinese philosophical thought. And this would be an indigenous theory for planning in China. Settler colonialism is predicated on the governance of the prior, by which settlers claim legal sovereignty over land, against which prior or pre-existing subjects and their laws are rendered non-legal, invalid, and mired in collective obligations. Black feminist Adrienne Marie Brown writes, imagination is one of the spoils of colonization, which in many ways is claiming who gets to imagine the future for a given geography. The imaginary of the Australian dream, for example, perpetuates settler colonialism with the curated aesthetics of suburban residential estates, whose master plans and actualisation are constructed on violences of denial and exclusion. Denial of previous human and other than human habitation of the place, terra nullius, and exclusion of those who would disrupt the way in which the world of the estate is envisaged. Noongar artist Sandra Hill's work, Nagalia, Steel to Purloin, on the left-hand side there, depicts the settlement chart for land subdivisions literally superimposed on top of First Nations people in Western Australia. But settler colonialism remains ongoing today, despite Development Agency website acknowledgements of First Nations people. On the right-hand side, you've got Development WA, the main state development organisation. Its first webpage, an acknowledgement of country. Straight underneath that, we're the development agency. We're going to bulldoze and just about appropriate all of this land. A big contradiction. Whoops. Decolonisation involves developing a politics of difference, not based on mere recognition or inclusion into dominant structures, but on different relationships to land. It involves dismantling structures that perpetuate the status quo, valuing First Nations knowledges. But as several authors point out, decolonisation is becoming a catch-all phrase or metaphor, which does little more than reconcile settler guilt and complicity and rescue settler futurity. It's been superficially adopted into social science curricula, including First Nations or Indigenous authors on reading list, acknowledging traditional owners on website, and at the beginning of lectures like I've just done. In some ways, this domesticates decolonisation. In addition, it might be argued that inclusion of practices such as Aboriginal fire management techniques into Australian Western-centric settler colonial systems is actually cultural appropriation, reformulating knowledge to fit the problems of Western practices. And here you've got 3 examples from the Nature Conservancy, Landcare Australia, and even the New York Times, suggesting that this is how it should be done. Bring Aboriginal ideas into the Western system. Now, Tuck and Yang argue that decolonisation like this is just a white settler narrative of guilt appeasement grafted onto pre-existing discourses and theories. Oh, sorry, apologies. Perhaps then it's time for planners to ask questions about decoloniality rather than decolonisation. Decoloniality does not assume that colonialism has ended and that it can therefore be historicised. Regarding his 2015 installation of used petrol cans, Expressions Decolonial, Beninois artist Romuald Hazume stated, "I send back to the West that which belongs to them, that is to say, the refuse of consumer society that invades us every day, or maybe it was the refuse of consumer society." So, stealing, borrowing, or begging. In 2015, Beth Rose Middleton called for new theories, which include attention to coloniality, culturally specific approaches in keeping with Indigenous knowledge systems, recognition of Indigenous self-determination, and explicitly dismantling systems of internalised and externalised colonial theorisation and practices. By way of taking decolonisation ideas further, I refer to Neil and Kowal's work on reparative and epistemic approaches, to which I add repatriative and reconciliatory approaches, and I'm going to go through these briefly, one at a time. They are simplified, artificial categories and labels, which may suppose boundaries between approaches. And of course, reality is inevitably more complex. So what does reparative decolonisation mean? The 2005 UN Basic Principles and Guidelines on the Right to a Remedy and Reparations, with a great long title, lists different types of reparation, including restitution of liberty and legal standing, financial compensation, rehabilitation socially and legally, and satisfaction, things like disclosing truths and public apologies. Reparation is frequently associated with financial compensation. However, the potential financial costs of reparative decolonisation are immense and make several government regimes, including Australia's, pretty scared of going down such a path. Because if Australia had to pay reparation to First Nations Australians for all the mineral extraction on the unceded land, it would bankrupt Australia. Repatriative, or as Tucker's called it, rematriative perhaps. They write about the decolonisation as the active repatriation of Indigenous land and life, rather than as a philanthropic process of westernised social justice. Full repatriation would mean the return of all unceded land to First Nations people and could involve the abolition of private property. Several commentators, such as Gundapur Quandamooka scholar Aileen Morton Robinson, claim that a Western-centric understanding of land ownership as private property devalues and erases First Nations ways of understanding and valuing land in Australia. Anishinaabe scholar Heather Dorries demonstrates how Canadian planning systems reinforce a racial property regime and reproduce racial inequality and oppression. And Janice Barry and her co-authors argue the need to re-problematize property in planning theory and practice away from a liberal economistic model and property as essentially private. They call for theories of value which recognize multiple values beyond those of price. If property is an inadequate category for conceptualizing anti-colonial and emancipatory approaches to planning, can there be planning without property? I can't answer that one. Reconciliatory decolonisation. Reconciliation Australia identifies 5 dimensions of reconciliation: race relations, equality and equity, institutional integrity, unity, and historical acceptance. In practice, however, much has boiled down to acknowledgements of country at the beginning of events, double naming or renaming of places, and inclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art and performance. These are all fairly limited, often falling back on the state and its imperialistic ways of doing, translating demands for reconciliation into a westernised model. For instance, media and private corporations widely use the slogan, always was, always will be, without the final 2 words present in the original Aboriginal version, always was, always will be, Aboriginal land. That's cultural appropriation writ large. In Western Australia, Noongar onto epistemologies are inherently landscape embedded, non-dualistic, recognising the agency of other than human entities in more than human relationships. They concern the knowledge path, which connects knowledge, people, place, and time. For Noongars, the land speaks and humans need to listen and understand. Storied memories of a long now merging past, present, and future ground Noongar onto epistemologies. Dreaming or knitting stories tell of the time before time when spirits created the landforms and living entities. Stories establish law for social and moral living, cultural patterns and customs. For instance, Budja, country, refers to more than human ecosystems. The term means nourishing terrain, illustrating the profoundly empathic human interrelationship with place, trees, animals, and each other. One's place and all its species, waterways, and entities are family. Due to kinship relations, Budja also means ecosystem, comprising landforms, food and water, sources, people, law, narratives, spirits, and so on. The land holds stories of wisdom for action guidance and reflection. Wolsterton et al. Propose that such a non-dualistic nature culture may be common to both Noongar and Western knowledge fields. The authors suggest there might be a third space of seeing and acting which synthesises the strengths of both. Working two-way is a Noongar expression of which emphasises such a third space where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander identity is empowered, prioritised and kept separate, but is also informed by other knowledges. Working two-way thus acknowledges both the differences between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal cultures and knowledge, and also the potential for them to work together. It's similar to the North American concept of two-eyed seeing, To consider the existence of different ontoepistemologies in this manner, where differences are brought into contact with each other, raises the issue of how they can interact. What types of relationships are possible between such different ontoepistemologies? How do we work through perceived or real incompatibilities? How are ways of theorizing shared or negotiated? Is there a third space which is generative and empowering rather than colonizing? A lot will depend on those involved and the conditions of negotiation. Relationality is often cited as being key to decolonization, but Tynan claims that relationality is often discarded in the quest for fragments of indigenous knowledge to be extracted, assimilated, and consumed by the settler colony. And ontoepistemologies may become appropriated mere trinkets for academic pontification or practitioner indicator checking. This is but another form of colonization. So how then might we meaningfully work along the frictive edges of interconnection and difference, compossibility and incompossibility, learning from the ontoepistemologies of First Nations people? Schauenberg and Kessler discuss the autoethnographic turn in design, which valorizes lived experiences, connecting them to larger cultural, political, and socio-economic issues. Storytelling is a key autoethnographic method. Planning would then become a conversation, an act of practicing ourselves through our senses. This is a 5 meter by 3 meter artwork called Yakalpa, or hunting ground in English, of the area around Pangur in Western Australia. Painted by 8 Martu women, it's an almost cartographic evocation of their country and what's important to them. Creek beds, animal crossing places, waterholes, hunting places, spinifex, sand dunes, and so on. The land is depicted at different times of year, incorporating ecological cycles associated with fire management of the spinifex and hunting practices. They say it's not a representation of the land, but the land itself. The autoethnographic painting reflects the Martu women's ontoepistemologies of place and time. It's their visual storied theorization of how to sustain life and place. As they say, this country is us. Critical and autoethnography are increasingly connected symbiotically with constructivist grounded theory. Stories are gathered and analysed, a new theory developed based on differences and commonalities across individuals and groups, subjective meanings and experiences. And here, Leonie Sandercock's self-reflective work regarding her projects in support of Canadian First Nations, I think, is really good. First Nations communities are themselves beginning to produce their own guidelines for ethical collaborations with non-Indigenous people, which respect the sovereignty of First Nations ontoepistemologies and navigate cultural sensitivities with deference. It takes time, effort, trust, transparency, and a willingness to be flexible on all sides to build relationships which are culturally appropriate, rather than engaging in the cultural appropriation or conceptual franchising or epistemic extractivism of tick box or add-on theories and practices. Epistemic extractivism does not seek to understand First Nations knowledges on their own terms, but extracts and colonizes ideas, removing them from the context in which they're produced and taken, perhaps stolen, by those who don't respect that some First Nations knowledges are restricted, for instance, to elders or to women, or inadequately recompensed and acknowledged, then appropriated and returned as fully developed theories, often under the name of a scholar from the global Northwest. Theories and practices of decolonization often steal or borrow First Nations onto epistemologies and First Nations people themselves. In addition, given apparent dominance in the literature of Black and other theorizations from the Americas, adopting such onto epistemologies in places like Australia could actually be a risk of their universalization and cultural appropriation and colonization. So is it possible to develop or perhaps beg theory more ethically? De Souza, Santos and Menezes suggest that the diversity of First Nations onto epistemologies and theorizations demonstrates the impossibility of a single ontology or theory, and that a plurality of onto epistemologies is necessary, which de Souza Santos calls epistemologies of the South. And he argues that such knowledges do not exist outside the social practices in which they occur. Anishinaabe scholar Kathy Absalon suggests that new theory must disrupt colonial constructs while asserting the power and role of Indigenous knowledge. And she offers this diagram, which I think is actually really useful. The right-hand side speaks of beginnings, histories, and visions. Visioning requires being able to see the past and the present and to envisage the future. It denotes the theoretical underpinnings and principles from which searching for knowledge begins. Knowledge entails awareness and understanding of Indigenous onto epistemologies and respectful consciousness of the sacred world and cosmos to Indigenous people. Indigenous holism implies balance achieved through interconnection, interdependence, and interrelationships between humans and other than humans. The lower quadrant valorizes relationships, recognizing that kinship system connects threads between individuals, families, communities, and extend beyond biology. The left side highlights respect for Indigenous and other onto epistemologies, recognizes the importance of the political context for critiquing and disrupting mechanisms of colonization. The upper quadrant refers to methodologies, from theories to processes, methods, and action. It emphasizes diversity of worldviews and experiences, and recognizes that not all Indigenous people aspire to be traditional or have traditional knowledge, and that some knowledges are restricted, and that a plurality of theories and practices is appropriate. In the center of the diagram is where the elements meet and locates integration, balance, interconnection, and holism. It could be argued that this is utopian, ignores the potential dangers of what's been called the dark side of decolonization, whereby First Nations people and their onto epistemologies are either appropriated within what remain essentially colonialist paradigms, or which actually impose new forms of colonialism. Esson et al. Even suggests that the pursuit of critical consciousness via a decolonial approach would do more harm than good if decolonization only involves consideration of knowledges rather than of the structures, the institutions, and practices which accompany them. I'm very wary of giving this talk today because while I think it's important for non-First Nations scholars to talk about First Nations onto epistemologies in general, I'm aware that I risk not speaking for, but instead of, those not only willing but able to speak for themselves. So I've offered what amounts to an overview of terms and some literature. I cannot speak for First Nations people. I stress that decentering or even ditching theories from the global Northwest is not itself equivalent to decolonization. Theories alone do not challenge and disrupt Western-centric systems, structures, and power. Recently, philosopher Claire Colbrook asked whether theory can save the world. I won't tell you her answer, but say that she warns us against appropriation of various non-Western others who think and theorize differently, just in order to save ourselves. I hope that I've shown that we need to problematize decolonization as both noun and verb. Does it reference reconciliation, repatriation, reparation, or onto epistemologies? What do people mean by indigenization? And how do discussions of all these terms treat issues of land and territory and property? And what does it all mean for our teaching and research? Merely including First Nations thought and references in scholarly praxis is not in itself decolonial, just as consulting a token local elder isn't in planning practice. It may indicate someone's wokeness or perhaps their eagerness to meet indicators, but it doesn't challenge the system as such. Planning will never be violence-free. There'll always be losers, as Patsy said earlier. There will always be some exclusion, disadvantage, and hierarchy of values involved. So we need to recognize and acknowledge exactly what this entails and why. Rather than simply adding on or appropriating, borrowing, and stealing First Nation stories and onto epistemologies, We need new theories, new vocabularies for resetting the coordinates of how spatial planning understands and theorizes space and spatial agency, how it understands past and imagined futures. This may well mean different theories for different histories, rather than universal theories as we've had in the past. Tanana Athabaskan Diane Million argues that theories rely on felt imagination at the parameters of the way things are thought to be. I suggest that planning theorists need to realign our felt imaginations in far more culturally appropriate and supportive ways if they are to have future credence. And I end by asking you, how do we theorize, research, and teach in a culturally appropriate manner? Because personally, as a privileged white settler, I feel inadequate. And so I'm looking to all of you for some ideas. So thank you.
Thank you so much. This is a wonderful provocation. And I think that we need a moment for reflection. And actually, I'm going to stop the recording now so that everybody can feel comfortable in participating. Thank you so much.